Okay, sorry for the delay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Charla Montalvo. I am the coordinator of the Roots and Shoots groups here in Puerto Rico, and we want to welcome you all to our last talk of this. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Sorry, I'm having trouble with my internet. I'm so sorry for that. Like I was saying, my name is Carla Montalvo. I'm the coordinator of the Roots and Shoots groups here in Puerto Rico. And tonight we have a special guest. We have the Dr. Leanne Grieves. She's from Ontario, Canada. So I'm just gonna introduce her before my internet decides to not work again. Dr. Leanne Grieves is an NSERC Postdoctoral Research Fellow at McMaster University in Ontario, Canada. Dr. Grieves' master's degree research focused on acoustic communication in smooth-billed annies, while her PhD research focused on chemical communication in songbirds. Now, Dr. Leanne is back in Puerto Rico studying how chemical cues may influence the social and breeding behavior of annies. So I'm just gonna leave Dr. Grieves to start her talk. So the microphone is all yours.
Great, thanks so much, Carla, and muchas gracias a todos for being here. Lo siento, yo hablo solamente un poquito de español, so I will give this presentation in English, pero I've tried to make all of the slides in español, and I apologize. I know that some of my translations will be incorrect, so I hope that everything will make sense, and I'll be really thrilled to answer questions at the end. So I'll be speaking today about the behavior and communication of the smooth-billed anis, or Crotophaga ani. And in my new edition of the Birds of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands Field Guide, I learned that another name for anis is the Black Witch, or La Bruja Negra. And so I use that name for this talk to replace some of the less flattering common names of this bird's como garapetero, tick eater, and other names that are not culturally appropriate. So I'll give a bit of an introduction to how it is that a couple of Canadians end up in Puerto Rico studying these tropical cuckoos. So it really begins with the man shown in the image at the top, Dr. Jim Quinn. He started working with smooth-billed anis in Puerto Rico in around 1998. And he was particularly interested in understanding how these birds cooperate and compete, given that they are these very social group living birds. He was particularly interested in their egg competition and the fact that they also cooperate to rear the young together in a single breeding group. And so he was really interested in these dynamics of cooperation and competition that I'll be talking to you more about shortly. For myself, I began working here in Puerto Rico with the anis in 2011 as a research assistant for Dr. Quinn. And I began my master's thesis research in 2012 and was here again in 2013. And then after I graduated in 2014, I came back to train a new student. And just this year, with the easing of some COVID restrictions, I've been able to come back as a postdoctoral researcher to study the Hyenas again, this time from their chemical communication. And so, as I mentioned, Dr. Quinn was really interested in understanding the evolution and maintenance of cooperative breeding in birds. And not only does he study the smooth-billed Hyenas, La Bruja Negra, he also works with Pukeko in New Zealand, which are a cooperatively breeding Rallidae. For myself, I'm very interested in social and breeding biology and behavior of the smooth-billed Hyenas, with a particular focus on how they're using communication to maintain and coordinate some of their really unique behaviors. So there will be 3 parts to my talk today. First, I'll share with you some information about smooth-billed Hyenas breeding biology and their behavior. Next, I'll talk about their acoustic communication, which is what I studied for my master's thesis. And then I'll end off telling you about the research that I'm currently in the field working with Hyenas, trying to work on right now regarding how they might use chemical communication or odor-based communication by smell. So the photo on the left shows the species range for the smooth-billed Hyenas. As you can see here, everywhere in purple is where the species occurs. They are not migratory, so they can be found from the southern tip of Florida, throughout the Caribbean, and into a lot of South America. Pero in Puerto Rico, I work with them in the southwest tip of the island, in El Refugio de la Vida Silvestre, U.S. Fish and Wildlife in Cabo Rojo, as shown on the map on the right here. So we work on the whole refuge property, and also we work at Finca Altamira, which neighbors the refuge. The landowners there kindly allow us to work with Hyenas on their property as well. So we're here every day for about 3 months, from October through the end of December, any years that Dr. Quinn has students interested in working on the Hyenas. And sometimes we also work in Laguna Cartagena and sometimes in Las Salinas as well. But we mostly work here in Cabo Rojo. And so many of you would already be familiar with this bird. Of course, you can often see them in groups together foraging or perched on fence lines or in trees like this. And the reason you see them in groups is because they're very social and they tend to breed cooperatively in groups. And so the group size can range from 2, that would be a single pair, a male and a female that are not cooperative breeding, just one socially monogamous pair, all the way up to 20 or even more adults. So you could have 10 breeding pairs in a single group. Breeding, just one social. And typically in the cooperatively breeding groups, as I mentioned, they're not obligate cooperative breeders. They can breed singly, but they rarely or somewhat infrequently do that. They usually breed cooperatively. And in this case, females will lay about 6 to 8 eggs in their clutch, but they'll build a single shared nest for the entire group. So every female in that group will put all of her eggs into that one nest that all group members help build. And as I mentioned earlier, they do cooperate to build the nest and to take care of the young, but they compete as well, especially during egg laying. Individuals will toss one another's eggs right out of the nest, like a lot of cuckoos do. They'll also bury each other's eggs under the nest floor. But once they have settled down and everybody is laying eggs, they will all take turns incubating the eggs, and they will all take turns feeding and caring for the young. So they have this really interesting mixture of cooperation and competition. Groups also roost together in a little huddled group, much like you see in the photo here. But when they're breeding, only one individual will incubate the nest overnight. We call that individual the nocturnal incubator, and this is usually a male. And so it's because of this really rare breeding system that we call joint nesting, where there's a single nest with multiple socially monogamous male-female pairs. So these are unrelated individuals primarily that come together into a single group, and they breed together, but they're not family members or kin. And these groups tend to sort of break apart at the end of the breeding season, and they'll reform maybe in different groups of different individuals in the following breeding year. So this system is only found in about 2% of the world's more than 10,000 bird species. And that's why we're studying this. So next, I thought I could give an overview of the kind of work that we do in our field season. So there are a lot of observations. Every year we travel the entire refuge and the farm, and we just find out where are the groups. They are territorial when they're breeding, and they tend to reuse similar territories from year to year. So we have traditional territories that are named based on the location of the trees that they tend to roost and nest in. And so every year we travel all around the refuge, we find out where all the groups are. We count how many individuals are in the group. Is it a pair of 2 birds? Are there 6 birds, 20 birds? We look for whether we have banded them in the past, if we could identify them. And then we spend a lot of time looking for evidence that they are breeding. So we will look for them carrying nest material, visiting trees that would make a suitable nest site, so on and so forth. And once we find and identify their nests, we will monitor those nests regularly. So here you can see some images with quite a number of eggs. Again, this is because there are more than one female laying in the same nest. So we mark and label every egg that is laid. If an egg is tossed out of the nest, we can then figure out what eggs are missing. Did it get tossed? Did it get buried? We measure the eggs because sometimes the females will lay different size of egg. So if we have little eggs and big eggs, sometimes we can tell there's 2 females laying. So we will record and monitor all of this. And then when the chicks hatch, we will again continue to monitor the nests, and we will take measurements that are common in ornithology to excuse me, to estimate the age of the chick based on its size and stage of development. And then we'll track how they are growing over time. Once they're big enough, we'll also put a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service band on them so they can be identified in the future if they survive into adulthood. And on the top right, you can see some color marks that I've been using to record the identity of the chicks in the nest. I put up video cameras and I look at how they are being fed at the nest and whether some individuals get more food or whether some adults feed certain individuals over others. And you can see on the top left, these nests can be in a range of heights, anywhere from low to the ground chest height all the way to over 30 meters in the 30 meters high. So we have a lot of different ladders that we carry around. And the Anis also prefer to nest in thorny trees like rollon or mesquite. And so you might not be able to see it, but I'm often covered in a lot of scratches from checking these nests every day. So it's hard work. We also first catch adults. Anis, they might look a little goofy when they're flying, but they're very smart and they actually are pretty agile flyers when they want to be. But we'll use mist nets like you can see in the top left. So for anyone who's not familiar, there are multiple panels of fine mesh on this net. And when a bird flies in, they don't see it because it's very thin. And we do this early in the morning when it's not very bright out. When a bird flies in, it should fall down into the pocket and get stuck. And then we immediately grab it and pull it out. And we could put bands on them so we can identify them. We put these bill marks so we can identify them quickly in the fields because it can be hard to see their legs. We take a lot of different measurements. The size of the breast and pico, the size of the bill can help us tell if the bird is male or female. We also collect a small blood sample so we can do genetic analysis of the bird's sex and also look at parentage in the nest, relatedness, things like this. And something I'll share with you later is that I am also collecting a little bit of preen oil from the bird's preen gland. And so we collect a lot of information from these birds. We only handle them for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we let them go again back to their business. And so here's just an example of some of the different adults we have caught this year with the different band combinations and bill marks. So anytime we go to a territory, we know which birds we have there, and we can just check that they're still present or look at them on our nest cameras and see what they're up to. And of course, next year, hopefully we'll find all these birds again when we come back. So now I'll move on to share with you about the vocal communication of smooth-billed anis, which was my master's thesis research. I had 3 major projects that I did for my master's. I documented and analyzed the vocal repertoire of the species. I did an experiment looking at alarm calls that they produce, and I did another experiment looking at agonistic calls that are associated with aggressive interactions. So I will talk about each of these projects. So looking at the vocal repertoire of this species, I basically went out with recording equipment for many, many, many hours, and I just recorded every sound I heard the anis make, every group, every individual, every day, all over the place. I took hundreds of recordings. And then I was able to visualize those sounds looking at a spectrogram of the different calls. Anis are not a songbird, so they do not have songs. They have single note calls. And then I was able to analyze the different acoustic features of these sounds and do some analysis on that I'll share with you. So this shows most of the call types I identified. I had 14 distinct call types that I had enough data to analyze, but I'm showing 11 here. And so each name is a name that I gave the call, trying to base it on what the call sounds like a little bit. And so I found all of these different call types, and whenever I was recording the birds vocalizing, I also made notes on the different context in which they made these calls. So for example, this first call on the top left is just called the ani call, and that's their basic sort of contact call that you could hear pretty much all the time. And shortly, I'll talk about these next two, the ani alarm, which looks quite similar, but has a little bit of difference at the end and at the intensity in the beginning, and the chirp, which again has a bit of a different appearance to it, but is a little bit similar. So as I mentioned, I could record and analyze a lot of different acoustic features. So the frequency, the duration, frequency modulation, a lot of different acoustic features. And after I analyzed all those, I was able to do this analysis that showed that that you could discriminate these different call types just using those vocal features. So to our ear, these calls probably sound different, but also to a computer, it could accurately categorize these calls into their different types, only having the vocal information of the sound features. So these are distinct, different call types. And what this all ended up showing me with these 14 different call types is that smooth-billed anis have a repertoire size that's comparable to or larger than that of other cooperatively breeding birds. And they had a pretty large vocal repertoire compared to non-songbirds. And there was a fairly high functional diversity of calls. And that means that a lot of these calls were associated with certain contexts. They were made in specific situations. And all of these features gave support for something that's called the social complexity hypothesis, which basically states that more social animals have to have more complex communication because they have a larger number of interactions and situations to navigate compared to animals that are more solitary and they have fewer interactions. So basically, anis make a lot of different calls because they hang out in these big groups and they have a lot of information they might need to communicate to one another. So moving on to their alarm calls, I mentioned that there was this ani alarm shown on the top row and something called the chirp shown on the bottom row. And the chirp is something that Dr. Quinn had been interested in for a number of years. And so myself, he, and our collaborator, Dr. David Logue, who used to work at UPR in Mayaguez, he's now at the University of Lethbridge. We all worked together to perform this experiment where we tested the hypothesis that ani alarms and chirps were alarm calls that were specific for certain predator types. And so I'll play you an example of the ani alarm. Oh, sorry, that's playing the chirp. I'll play you the chirp first. So it's a short burst. And then the ani alarm, so that's a longer call and it's more similar to their regular contact call. But again, when you measure the variables and if you look and listen closely, it is a little different in the intensity. And so we had noticed that the anis chirp when there are raptors like hawks or merlins flying over. And we noticed that they would ani alarm when we get too close, but also when there's something like a dog or a mongoose. And so we decided to do this playback experiment where we would play these different call types. And we also, for a control, something neutral they shouldn't react to, we just played white noise that was about the same duration as either an ani call or a chirp. That was the chirp again, sorry about that. That's the white noise. So we had these 3 playback types. And I basically went out and we approached smooth-billed ani groups when they were perched high atop a tree where they would be exposed to aerial predators. They'd be at risk of getting attacked or eaten by an aerial predator. And we thought then they should be really likely to respond to a chirp if the chirp indicates that there's an aerial predator. And then we also played the other playback types to see what they would do. But we had a different situation too, where the birds were low or on the ground, where we thought they would be more at risk from terrestrial predators. Sorry about that. So I have a couple videos to show you examples of how these playback trials worked. So up top here, you'll see at least 3 anis. They're perched up high, exposed from above, at risk of aerial predation, we think. And then we're going to do a playback that you'll hear.
Nice. Okay. Beautiful.
And that's
Okay.
Jim that you hear at the end. So hopefully you could hear that chirp, and then the Anis dove completely out of sight. There were no predators around when they were only responding to that sound, the chirps that we recorded and presented them. And next, we have a couple birds here on the right that are low and maybe at risk from terrestrial predators. So there again, we played the chirp playback there, and actually instead of diving down into cover like in the last situation where they were perched high, they flew into the base of the tree and out of sight still. Now again, we have birds that are perched high and exposed, perhaps to risk of aerial predation. And so that was the Ani alarm, and they did not react to it, but they were high up at the top of a tree. And then we have this other context. You can't see the birds right now, but they're low down behind this tree. And we'll play that Ani alarm again. So in that clip, when the birds are down low and potentially at risk of terrestrial predation, when they hear that Ani alarm, again, there's no actual predators around, it's just the sound that they hear, they all fly up higher and start looking around, and they're quite obvious. So after all of these different trials and treatments, if you look on the left-hand side of this graph, we had the proportion of groups that responded to the different playback types. And in 2011, we did the experiment. Every group had to be perched high and exposed from above, like at risk of aerial predation. And the stars here show you this was a statistically significant result where 50% of the groups dove down in response to the chirp. So like you saw in that first video where they just dive straight out of sight. None of them flew to cover because they were perched up high. And none of them flew up because they were perched up high. In 2012, when we changed that context where they were perched low, less than a meter, or on the ground, which we thought would make them at greater risk of terrestrial predation, again, about half of the groups would dive down if they were not on the ground. If they were 1 meter, they would dive down into cover in response to the chirp. Or if they were on the ground already, like in the second video, they would fly sort of horizontally low into cover, like into a shrub or at the base of a tree. But the key thing here was that when they were perched lower on the ground and we played them this Ani alarm, they would fly up and become visible. So they really seemed to be responding appropriately to these different alarm call types as though they represented terrestrial for the Ani alarm and aerial for the chirp predator-specific alarm calls. And as we were doing this experiment, I also recorded natural occurrences of aerial predators like merlins, red-tailed hawks. Sometimes they even would respond if we had peregrine falcons, even American kestrels, sometimes they would respond to, although not particularly a threat. They sometimes go after them. And what we found was that in the wild, these chirps are predominantly given in response to some kind of aerial threat, like a hawk or a falcon. And those Ani alarms are primarily given in response to a terrestrial threat, like stray dogs, mongoose, something like that. And they don't usually make either of these call types when there are no threats. So these two things together really showed that the chirp is a specific call that indicates there is threat of an aerial predator, and the ani alarm is a specific call that indicates there is threat of a terrestrial predator. And so this experiment tested the referential signaling hypothesis. And under this hypothesis, you should see stimulus-specific signaling. So a signal or sound in this that's produced only in response to a certain stimulus. So if you see a hawk, you chirp. If you see a dog, you ani alarm. And similarly, these types should be elicited by a limited set of stimuli. So you don't chirp every time a bird flies above you. You only chirp when a threatening bird like a raptor flies above you. And they don't usually chirp, for example, in response to turkey vultures, which are not a threat. And then the response when an individual hears the call should be independent of the context. So that's why we made sure there were no predators around, there were no actual threats. They just heard the sound, there was no context, but they still respond appropriately to the sound. So that suggested that these really are referential signals. Chirps mean aerial predator, ani alarm means terrestrial threat or predator. So finally, again, going back to that vocal repertoire study, I became quite interested in this other vocalization called the hoot. And this is kind of a low, short, guttural call. I play an example here. And something that I noticed, smooth-billed anis are territorial during breeding. And so often what happens is individuals will try to join a group, or they'll enter a breeding group territory, and then members of the group will spend a lot of time and energy chasing them and trying to kick them out of their territory. Sometimes these chases fail and the new bird joins the group. We don't understand this very well, but they do a lot of chasing in the breeding season, trying to get individuals off their territory or out of their group. And often when they do this behavior, I noticed that they make these hoot calls. And so I thought that maybe these hoots were some kind of aggressive signal indicating, hey, get out of my territory or I'm going to mess you up. Anis can have quite violent fights. They'll fight with their claws and their bills, and they'll even tumble to the ground. They fight so vigorously sometimes. And something else when they're chasing is they have this visual display that I call the throat inflation display that you can see a little bit of in the photo on the right, where they have this throat pouch that they sort of inflate. You can see the skin there under the bill is exposed. Normally that would be covered by their feathers, but they sort of puff it out and they open their bill a little bit, even if they're not vocalizing, and they tend to crane their head forward when they do this too. So they have this visual display also that tends to accompany these behaviors associated with chasing. So to test if this hoot and throat inflation display might be indicating a willingness or an intention to attack an intruder, I designed another playback experiment, and this time I had a taxidermic mount. So I had a stuffed smooth-billed ani named Stinky. And underneath we have a playback speaker. This would play either that regular ani alarm, just to broadcast to the birds I was doing the experiment on, there's a bird here, you need to come defend your territory. Or it would play a mix of the ani alarm and the hoot. And I thought this might communicate, hey, I'm a bird on your territory and I'm ready to fight you. So maybe that would be a more aggressive bird in the playback. Here's just a microphone so I could record any vocalizations that the experimental birds, the test birds, might make as they approach the mount. And if you're curious about this little wire frame, it would sit above the bird and there would be like a sheet covering it with a rope attached. And as the birds approached, I would pull the sheet away to reveal the intruder. And so here's an example of how this experiment would look. You'll hear the ani alarm that's just coming from the playback, and then you'll see a bird come in from the left, And then you'll hear some vocalizations that the bird makes that are picked up on that microphone. So I'll play that video again. You can see sort of that sideways low posture of the bird. And if you look closely, you can see it's doing the throat inflation display. It has its throat puffed out. It makes a few hoots, and then it makes the attack on the mount. Oh, my playback's not working. Hang on, I'll see if I can. Oh, sorry, it's I don't know why that's not working now. Let's see if. Oh, well, I'll try to play it again later if I can. I'm not sure why the playback is frozen, but hopefully you could see some of those features in that video clip. So again, I went to a number of groups and I did these playbacks exactly like this every time as best I could. And again, if you look on the left-hand side first, where it says attack, you notice that often the birds hooted before they attacked, the black bars, but most of the time they did that throat inflation display, whether or not they hooted. And they did this both when I just used that Ani playback or when I did the Ani plus hoot playback, but they responded a little less when hoots were included in the playback. So maybe they got a little bit threatened by that mount when they heard the hoots. But they did basically the same thing in response to the mount in both playback types. But when individuals did not end up attacking the mount, so I did a lot of trials and they didn't always attack, but when they attacked, they usually did the hoots and the throat inflation. And when they did not attack, they almost never made a hoot and they never made the throat inflation display. So this experiment provided some support for the predictive criterion for signals of aggressive intent. So this means that the signal of aggressive intent should occur in the context of an aggressive interaction. In this case, the mount was a territory intruder simulation, and that's when they made the signal. But they didn't make that signal if they didn't follow it up with an attack. In this case, the throat inflation, the visual display, was actually a stronger predictor of attack than the hoot, but the hoot was still a significant predictor of attack as well. I should say from behavioral observations that the Anis do hoot in other contexts as well, and that's something, again, we don't understand that well. So they will hoot in the morning in their communal roost, like amongst each other, and it's kind of unclear what that means. Sometimes they hoot when they're a little bit agitated or disturbed. If you do playback, they will sometimes hoot. And so it's often associated with agonistic or aggressive interactions, but whether they're hooting in the roost because they're grumpy with each other or having some group conflict, we don't understand that very well yet. So finally, I'll just tell you a little bit about the research I'm doing now, which is to look at how Anis might use smell or chemicals to communicate and coordinate some of these complex behaviors that they do. Chemical communication is the most ancient, early evolved form of communication, and it's taxonomically widespread. So all living organisms today use chemicals to communicate at least to some degree. And we know that a lot of animals use chemical communication in a variety of social contexts. So for example, a lot of mammals like mongoose and others have odor producing glands, and they will use these glands to mark to scent mark or to put odorous compounds to mark their territory and sometimes to show off their size. So bigger animals can mark higher than smaller animals, and that might show, don't come here, I'm bigger than you, and you'll lose in a fight. And we also know that in social group living mammals like hyenas, these scents that they produce can also contain a lot of important social information. So hyenas and other mammals have anal glands that produce an odorous paste. And if you analyze the chemical composition of that paste, they're actually different chemical profiles for different kinds of individuals in a group. So this figure on the right is showing in orange, you have immigrant males who are just kind of passing through and they're not really going to stay in the group because hyenas have a female dominating social system. And then in that sort of burgundy color, you can see the chemical profiles of lactating females are different from those immigrant males and more similar to each other. And then in gold, you can see that the pregnant females also have a little bit different chemistry than the other groups. So these odors can indicate information about reproductive status in this case, maybe also the sex, sometimes maybe dominant status or health, and a lot of other features. So in birds, mostly today, even still, a lot of people think that birds don't really use or have a sense of smell. But I'm here to tell you that's totally not true. All birds can smell, and they use smell in a huge variety of contexts. So here are some examples of birds that are quite well known for having a sense of smell, like the turkey vultures or other carrion eaters on the bottom left, and you can see how huge their nostrils are. Similarly, for petrels and seabirds, they can spend days foraging on the open ocean, locating food by scent cues alone. You have the crested auklet on the top right, and they actually produce during the breeding season this tangerine scented odor on the back of their neck that seems to be involved in their reproduction, but we don't really understand that very well. And then on the bottom right, we have the brown kiwi, a flightless nocturnal bird. They've got teeny tiny eyes. And my picture didn't load properly, but you'll have to look up some photos if you don't believe me, but they don't have nostrils at the base of the bill like most birds do. The nostrils are actually located at the very tip of the bill, and they actually smell around in the leaf litter at night for worms and other invertebrate food. So they smell out their food in the absence of light. But it turns out, again, it's not just these birds with big nostrils that can smell. All birds can use smell. And a lot of their body odor can actually come from their preen gland or uropygial gland, which is located at the base of their tail, like in this crossbill. So here's just a blow up of how the preen gland looks. It's a little papilla at the base of the tail. When a bird's preening or grooming itself, like this crossbill, you'll see they actually rub or probe that gland with their bill. And that causes a little bit of oil to be secreted that then they groom throughout their feathers. And that can give them some odor that can convey information to other individuals. So for my PhD research, I looked at this in a small songbird that's really common throughout North America called the song sparrow. And when I collected preen oil from birds in different populations, I found that they have distinct chemical profiles. So these two populations have different preen oil chemical composition, or in other words, they seem like they probably smell differently from one another. And also when you look at males and females, just like in the Anis, these are monomorphic birds. Males and females do not look any different, but they have a different chemical profile to their preen oil. So females here plot out in purple and males in yellow. And there's a lot of other ways that preen oil can vary based on different individuals' quality and status. So what I'm working on right now is to see whether, like the social mammals, like the hyenas, whether these really social smooth-billed anis might use chemical communication to gather information about each other, maybe their readiness to breed. We know that females are competing at the nest, tossing and burying eggs. And maybe there's some chemical cues that they can use to tell if individuals are ready to breed or not. They do hang out really close together and they preen and groom each other. So something else I'm really interested in when I collect this preen oil is maybe groups have a more similar odor within, like group members might share an odor. If you imagine each color here is a group, maybe there's a more similar group odor compared to the odor of individuals of non-group members. Kind of like different lactating and pregnant females have a different smell. Maybe group members have a different smell, and maybe they can use this to identify, you're my group mate, you're not, you're an intruder, or you're ready to breed, you're not. Things like that. So that's something that I don't have data on yet. I've been out in the field every day for the past few months, collecting samples and looking at this. And so maybe next year I'll be able to tell you more about whether or not any of this is happening. And so with that, I have so many people to thank, a lot of field assistants over the years, and many people who have helped in a huge variety of ways. But I'll leave it there, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Leanne. I really love the presentation. I didn't know any of that information about the smooth-billed ani. So for me, everything is new. I just know that we love watching them when we are going to the field. So thanks for sharing that. I don't know if anyone has any question. You can open your microphone and you can do the question, or you can write it on the chat.
And also, if you think of questions later, I think at the start I put my, I forgot to put my email, but I have a Twitter handle that's there if anyone wanted to send a message. But I could put my email in the chat too. Maybe I'll do that.
Yes, we would love to have your email so we can write to you later too. I see a question here, I think. Says from Campino. It says, great talk. What is the conservation status of anis in Puerto Rico? And how does your research apply to that?
Oh, thanks. They are not a species of concern at all. They're quite abundant. And so we don't really have a specific conservation goal for them. One of the reasons we work with them is because they're pretty common, it makes it a little easier for us to, to see enough individuals to start to understand their behavior. But more broadly, I think, there are a lot of species at risk, of course, as you know, and if we can study some of the more common species and understand if these kinds of behaviors are occurring, we might be able in the future to apply that to species at risk. So if we find out, for example, that chemical information is really important, but there's a lot of environmental pollution that might alter their odors, it might impact how birds are able to communicate. And that's something we don't really think about in conservation right now. So again, the anis are not at all at risk. They're quite abundant. A lot of people consider them a nuisance, but maybe this work could inform conservation for other species in the future.
Thank you, Leanne. You also have some comments here from Carmen. She says she loved the pictures.
Oh, thanks. A lot of them are mine, and there's some I noted that were from a local photographer here that he was generous enough to share. So Jose Almodovar has a Facebook page where he shares his photography, and he lent me some of these photos too.
They all look amazing. They
Thanks.
look so cute. Also
Hello.
here is, hello.
I got a quick question. Have you
Yeah.
made any comparison with the behavior of the same species in other areas of the island, just to see whether those are particular of that area?
That's a great question, and we would love to, but we haven't had a chance to. The Anis are not so easy to work with. And so we really only know the most from in Cabo Rojo, but not only in other parts of the island, but in some other parts of their range. It would, like in South America or even in Florida, it would be amazing to know how much variation there is. And I think a lot of, for example, some of their breeding behavior and their group sizes and things like that is probably related to environmental variables. We do see changes in Cabo Rojo, like from year to year. And so probably there are differences, but we haven't studied that yet. Yeah, it's a great question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. You also have a connected? Yeah.
Thank you for inviting me, Leanne, to your presentation. I feel it's just so opportune from so far away to get to see you and hear about what you're doing.
Thanks, Mom.
Yeah, and you look very beautiful and sunny, and you know, but it's so wonderful to see you and hear from you, and I hope everything goes well from now and until you finish everything up okay within the next week or two.
Thank you.
Love you here. Feliz Navidad.
Feliz Navidad. I think I see Amanda asking, do we have a volunteer program? We do it here, hire field assistants. It is, sadly, we don't have funding right now, so it is volunteer. And I would love to, often we have volunteers who come from the US or this year from Canada. But it would be great to have folks from Puerto Rico who could join us. In the past, you know, I have and check stuff out. So you could definitely email if you're interested. But yeah, we do hire field assistants every year. And currently I'm looking into some funding that I hope could maybe make a little bit of a stipend for people to help with the work. So yeah.
Yeah, I share Amanda's question too, and I write to you about it. So we will be, you know, more than glad to help whenever you need it, as soon as we finish with the final exams and all that. But you can count with us, and we would love to learn more about that, about the species. So thanks for sharing that. Also, Joan from Argentina says thank you, and Elia Maldonado too. She's watching from Canada too. She says thank you, great presentation. So we all love it. I don't know if anyone else has another question, or they just can write to Dr. Leanne and ask the question later on.
Sorry,
Carla. My internet is not helping today.
Okay, I heard some of that, and I know it's a busy time of year, but definitely get in touch when you're less busy, and we'd love to have you out if we can make that work.
Yeah, sure. We will love that. So thanks so much, Leanne, for the presentation. And for me, everything, all the information you share is new, because when we go out to the field and we do bird counts, we see the smooth-billed Annie, but you know, I never think of of any of the information that you share. I didn't know about their behavior and or any of that. So thanks for sharing all that information with us. Last week we were in the Salinas or Cabo Rojo doing a bird count, so we saw them, and I was telling Jose Camacho, look, this will be Hyenas. We'll be having a presentation about them. So it's great to hear all that.
Yeah, it's my, you're welcome. It's my pleasure to talk about these birds. So I'm always happy to share how cool they are, and yeah, they're a lot of fun. So and they're very confusing.
It's okay. Well, thanks so much for being with us and being part of the, of the last webinar of the year to use to make a closure for our Forever Wild campaign. So thanks for being with us. And if anyone can just open their camera so we can take a picture before we leave, we will appreciate that. So I'm just gonna stop here the live Facebook transmission and the recording too.